Hell's Angels biker took little girl's hand and led her to safety. But the twist he uncovered will shock you. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. Jake Razor Morrison was used to being on his own. The roar of his Harley-Davidson was his constant companion as he cruised down the long stretches of highway. A man who had learned long ago to keep his emotions buried deep inside. Life as a Hell's Angel had taught him that attachments made you weak, and he was anything but weak. His reputation was built on raw power and a fearsome presence. Yet, even in the midst of the cold night, there was a part of him that still sought something beyond the constant ride, something that gave him a reason to keep going. As he sped down the road, the storm that had been threatening all evening finally hit. The rain began to fall in sheets, making the road slick and dangerous. The wind howled, pushing against him, but Jake didn't slow down. He had ridden in worse weather. But then, something caught his ear, a faint cry, almost drowned out by the roar of the storm. He slowed, his eyes scanning the road ahead. There, just off the shoulder, he saw a figure. A little girl. She was standing alone, drenched and shivering, her small frame barely visible in the storm's fury. His heart skipped a beat. Jake wasn't one to stop for anyone, especially not a stranger. But something about her, standing there in the rain, helpless, made him pull over. He killed the engine and got off the bike, the cold air biting at his skin as he approached her. The girl looked up at him with wide, fearful eyes. Her clothes were soaked through, and she looked like she hadn't been in this world for long. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She flinched, her eyes darting too. His leather jacket and the Hell's Angel patch on his back. He could see the fear in her eyes. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake froze, taken aback by the desperation in her voice. He crouched down to her level, trying to appear less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just here to help," he said, his voice calm. She didn't seem convinced, but at least she didn't pull away. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to break through her fear. "Emma," she whispered. "Emma, you're going to be all right. I'm going to take you somewhere safe." He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, guiding her towards his bike. The girl hesitated for a moment, but then allowed him to help her. As he sat her on the back of the Harley, Jake's mind raced. He had no idea who this little girl was or what she was doing out here alone. But one thing was clear, she needed help, and he wasn't about to leave her stranded. He revved the engine and sped off, the rain still coming down hard as they made their way down the road. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling this way. He wasn't used to caring about anything or anyone. But Emma's trust in him, even though it was shaky, was something he hadn't expected. As they drove, the storm intensified, but Jake's focus was on getting her to safety. He wasn't sure where they were going, but he knew he couldn't let her down. The twist came when they reached his old garage, the place that had been his refuge from the world, a place filled with memories of a different time, a different man. As Jake opened the door and helped Emma inside, he noticed something strange. There, in the corner of the room, was an old photograph, a photo of a little girl, smiling, with a bike similar to the one Emma was holding onto. His breath caught in his throat as he realized who she was. Emma wasn't just any little girl. She was the daughter of someone from his past, someone he had tried to forget. And now, she was standing in front of him, with nowhere else to go. The twist wasn't just about the storm or the girl. It was about the connection that had been buried deep in his past, a connection that had come back to find him when he least expected it. The rain had started to taper off as Jake sat Emma down on the old couch in his garage. The harsh sounds of the storm were replaced by the quiet hum of his workbench, and the smell of motor oil and metal filled the air. His garage, once a place where he fixed bikes and found solace, now felt different. Emma's presence, though uncertain and fragile, had somehow changed the energy of the place. As she sat there, her small frame wrapped in a blanket, Jake couldn't help but look at her, wondering who she was and how she had ended up in such a desperate situation. He had seen many things in his life, things that had hardened him, but Emma's innocence was a reminder of a world he had long forgotten. He could see the fear in her eyes, the kind that came from being abandoned, from being left alone in a world that wasn't kind. Yet, she had trusted him. That was something he didn't take lightly. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked, his voice rough, not accustomed to softening his tone. Emma nodded slowly, her eyes still wide, filled with a mix of fear and curiosity. She hadn't said much since they left the highway, and Jake wasn't sure if it was the shock of what had happened or the confusion of being in a stranger's garage. Jake moved to the small fridge in the corner of the room, grabbing what little food he had, some cold pizza and a bottle of water. He placed it on the table in front of her and sat down across from her, his large frame towering over her small figure. He didn't know what to say. He was never good with kids. But there was something about Emma that made him want to do better. "You're safe here," Jake said, his voice a little softer this time. "No one's going to hurt you." Emma looked up at him, studying him carefully, as if weighing his words. She hesitated before picking up the pizza and taking a small bite. Jake watched her, his mind racing. He had lived through enough to know that there was more to Emma's story than met the eye. She wasn't just some random kid who got lost in the rain. There was a depth to her, something that spoke of a past much darker than what she was letting on. As Emma ate, Jake's mind drifted to his own past. He had been running from something his whole life, running from his mistakes, from the violence, from the things he had done that he couldn't take back. But as he sat there, watching Emma, he realized that maybe he was tired of running. Maybe this was his chance to do something different. He had no idea what it meant to protect someone, to care for someone. His whole life had been about survival, about looking out for number one. But now, with Emma sitting in front of him, everything felt different. She didn't need him to be a tough guy. She didn't need him to be anything other than what he was in that moment. Someone who could keep her safe. After a few minutes, Emma finished her food and looked up at Jake, her expression changing from fear to something else, something he couldn't quite place. "Why did you stop for me?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Jake was taken aback by the question. He hadn't really thought about it. He had just acted on instinct, something inside him telling him to help her. But now, hearing her ask, he wasn't sure how to answer. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe because you needed help." Emma nodded slowly, as if she understood. "I've been running too," she said quietly. Jake's brow furrowed, not sure what she meant. "What do you mean?" he asked. Emma hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running from someone. Someone who hurt me. I don't know where to go now." Jake felt a pang in his chest, a sharp, familiar ache. He had heard those words before, in his own life. He had been running from something, from someone. But hearing them from Emma, hearing the vulnerability in her voice, hit him harder than he expected. "You don't have to run anymore," Jake said, his voice steady. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." Emma looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and disbelief. For the first time since he found her, Jake saw a flicker of trust in her eyes. But just as quickly, that trust was clouded by something else. There was a fear, deep in her gaze, that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just the storm or the situation. It was something bigger, something that he wasn't sure he could protect her from. Just as Jake was about to speak, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared outside. His body tensed immediately, his instincts kicking in. The unmistakable sound of Hell's Angels' bikes filled the air, and Jake knew that whatever peace he had found in this moment was about to be shattered. He stood up, moving toward the window to peer outside. For bikes pulled into the driveway, their riders clad in leather and patches that marked them as part of his world. Jake's world. And he knew that they weren't here for a friendly visit. They were here because of Emma. He turned back to her, his heart racing. "Stay here," he said firmly, his voice full of authority. "Whatever you hear, don't come outside." Emma looked at him, her face filled with confusion and fear. But before she could say anything, Jake had already moved toward the door, ready to face the consequences of his actions. He had no idea what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. Everything had just changed. Jake stepped closer to the window, his gaze focused on the bikes outside. He knew these men. They were his brothers, but the last thing he wanted was for them to find Emma. He could hear their engines rumbling as they parked, the sound unmistakable, the unmistakable warning of what was to come. His heart raced in his chest, but he kept his face calm, his eyes trained on the group gathering outside. He took a deep breath, reaching for his leather jacket. The door creaked open, and the voices of the men outside began to drift in. Jake recognized the voice of Steele Murphy, the chapter president of his Hells Angels branch, and his gut tightened. The last thing Jake needed was a confrontation. "Jake!" Steele's voice rang out, loud and commanding. "Where are you? We need to talk." Jake knew he had no choice. He had to face them. He turned away from the window and looked at Emma, who had stood up and was peeking through the crack in the door, her face filled with confusion and anxiety. "Stay inside," he said firmly, locking eyes with her. "I'll handle this." Emma hesitated, but then nodded slowly, her wide eyes watching him closely. She could sense the tension in the air. Jake stepped outside, his boots heavy against the ground, each step feeling like a weight pressing down on him. He pulled the door shut behind him, the sound of it closing echoing in the silent garage. As he walked toward the group, Steele and the others turned to face him. "Jake," Steele said again, his tone softer now, but still carrying an edge of authority. "You've been laying low for a while. What's going on here? We need to know what you're up to." Jake's mind raced. He had never been good at hiding things from Steele, but this was different. He couldn't let them know about Emma. Not yet. He forced a calm expression onto his face as he approached them. "Nothing's going on," Jake replied, his voice steady. "I've been keeping to myself, just working on bikes." Same old, same old." Steele raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Is that so?" He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't look like you're just working on bikes, Jake. You've got a lot of things going on here. What's with the kid?" Jake's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't afford to let anything slip. "She's just a kid I found," Jake said, his voice casual. "She was lost, scared. I'm just helping her out." Steele's gaze didn't soften. He studied Jake for a long moment, his eyes searching for something Jake couldn't quite put his finger on. "Jake," Steele said quietly, "you've always been a tough guy, but don't try to play me. We've known each other too long." Jake's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "I'm not playing anyone, Steele. I'm just doing what's right." The tension in the air was thick, but Steele didn't push any further. Instead, he stepped back and nodded to the others. "All right, Jake," he said, his voice gruff. "But we'll be keeping an eye on you. And if you've got something to hide, you better be ready to face the consequences." The men turned to leave, but Steele lingered for a moment longer. "Take care of yourself, Jake. You're one of us. But remember, we don't get involved in anything that'll bring the heat." Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know." As Steele and the others mounted their bikes and drove off, Jake felt the weight of their presence lift. But it wasn't over yet. He had no idea what kind of trouble he was getting into, but one thing was certain. He couldn't protect Emma from everything. He turned back toward the garage and walked inside. Emma was standing by the door, her eyes wide with worry. "Are they gone?" she asked softly. Jake nodded, trying to reassure her. "Yeah, they're gone." He paused, his mind still racing. The last thing he wanted was for her to get involved in his mess. But now, it was too late to turn back. He had already made a choice, and there was no going back now. Emma stepped closer, her small figure looking fragile in the dim light of the garage. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Jake didn't answer at first. He couldn't let her see how unsettled he was. But the truth was, he wasn't okay. He had just made a promise to himself that he was going to protect her, no matter the cost. He took a deep breath, pushing the anxiety down, and looked at Emma. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to figure this out." Emma gave him a small smile, a look of trust in her eyes. For the first time since she had arrived, Jake felt like maybe he wasn't as lost as he thought. But the storm wasn't over yet. The rain had stopped, but something told him that the real storm was just beginning. The days following Steele and the other bikers' visit were quieter, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from over. The world outside seemed to have slowed down, but inside his garage, everything felt as though it was moving at full speed. Emma had settled into a routine, spending her days in the corner of the garage, reading books she had found on a dusty shelf. Jake made sure she had everything she needed, but there was still a part of him that couldn't stop thinking about the dangers lurking just outside the door. He tried to focus on the work at hand, repairing bikes for a few local customers who had heard about his shop. But it wasn't the engines or the tools that occupied his mind. It was Emma. She was still a mystery. To him, a puzzle he couldn't quite piece together. Despite the calm she seemed to have found in his garage, Jake knew her past was more complicated than she let on. And it wasn't just her past. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things she hadn't said. Why had she been on the highway alone in the middle of a storm? Who was she running from? Jake's eyes kept darting to the corner where she sat, her small figure absorbed in a book. She seemed content for the moment, but Jake couldn't ignore the gut feeling that something was off. As the days passed, his sense of urgency grew. He had to find out more. He couldn't keep living with this uncertainty, not when it came to someone he had promised to protect. One evening, after a long day of working on bikes, Jake decided it was time to talk to Emma. He had waited long enough. He found her sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, flipping through pages of an old magazine. "Emma," Jake said, his voice a little more forceful than he intended. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him hesitate. "I need to know what happened," he said quietly, taking a step closer. "I know you've been through a lot, and I know you're not telling me everything. I just need to understand." Emma's expression shifted slightly, the calm mask she had been wearing slipping just a little. She set the magazine down, folding her hands in her lap, her small fingers twisting nervously. Jake waited, giving her time to process, but the silence between them felt thick, as if it was filled with unspoken words. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know who to trust anymore," she said, her words heavy with something that sounded like fear. "I ran because I couldn't stay there. I couldn't go back. I don't know where else to go." Jake felt a pang in his chest, a familiar feeling that made him want to reach out and comfort her, but he knew better. He had been down this road before. "Who were you running from?" he asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Emma hesitated, her eyes flicking to the side as if she was trying to find the right words. "My father," she said, her voice cracking slightly. He wasn't always like that. But something changed. And one day he just snapped." Jake's heart sank as he listened to her words. He had been through his own share of nightmares, but hearing Emma's story hit him differently. It was the kind of thing he had heard from too many people, the kind of thing that never stopped haunting them. He stepped closer, kneeling down in front of her. "You're safe here," he said, his voice firm, as if reassuring himself as much as her. "You don't have to worry about him anymore. No one's going to hurt you." Emma met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of disbelief and hope. "But what if he finds me? What if he comes looking for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "He won't find you," he said with more certainty than he felt. "You're safe. You're not alone anymore." Emma looked at him for a long moment, as if searching for something in his eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly, the weight of her fear lifting just a little. But Jake knew this wasn't over. He had promised to protect her, and he would, no matter what it took. The next day, Jake went into town to check in with a few of his old contacts. He needed to make sure Emma was safe, that no one knew where she was. The town wasn't big, but word could spread fast, especially with the kind of people who knew Jake. As he made his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He didn't see anyone directly, but the nagging feeling stuck with him. By the time he got back to the garage, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the driveway. He parked his bike and walked inside, but something felt off. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to notice. He pushed it open cautiously, his senses alert. Emma was sitting on the couch, her eyes wide with a look of panic. "Jake," she whispered, her voice shaking. "There's someone outside. I saw them watching through the window." Jake's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't been gone long, but the feeling of being followed had finally caught up to him. Without saying another word, he moved toward the window, peering out into the growing darkness. In the distance, he saw the flicker of headlights, but they were too far away to make out clearly. Jake turned back to Emma, his expression grim. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "I'll take care of this." Jake stood still for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the surroundings from the window. He could feel his heart racing, the familiar tension creeping back into his chest. It wasn't the first time he had felt the weight of being watched, but this time, something about it felt different. He had promised Emma she was safe here, but now, standing in the silence of the garage, he wasn't so sure. He turned back to Emma, who was still sitting on the couch, her face pale with fear. Her eyes were wide, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket around her. "Stay low," Jake said, his voice firm. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." Emma nodded quickly, though her eyes showed just how scared she was. Jake walked toward the door, his boots heavy against the concrete floor. He pulled on his leather jacket, his fingers brushing the familiar patches on his vest as he did. It was a sign of his past, his brotherhood, but tonight, it didn't feel like the protective armor it once was. It felt like a target. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit him, sharp and biting. He moved quickly, his eyes darting to every corner of the yard, every shadow. The headlights he had seen earlier were still visible, moving slowly down the street. It wasn't just the car, it was the way it was moving. Too slow, too deliberate. Whoever was driving was watching, waiting. Jake's instincts kicked in. He knew the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that the moment you stop paying attention, it's over. He had been trained for moments like this. But as much as he wanted to keep a cool head, the image of Emma inside, vulnerable and alone, pushed him to move faster. He crept along the side of the garage, trying to stay out of sight. The headlights from the car grew brighter, getting closer to the driveway. Jake crouched behind a stack of old tires, his breath steady despite the rising tension. He could hear the car now, the engine humming softly as it approached. It was time. He waited for the car to pass the driveway, just enough for him to make his move. The car was close enough now, and Jake knew he had a few seconds. As the vehicle passed, he moved quickly, making his way toward the back of the car. He could hear voices now, low, muffled. Someone was talking. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he peeked around the corner. There were two men standing by the car, their backs to him. Both were wearing dark jackets, their faces shadowed. Jake took a deep breath, his body tensing. He wasn't sure what these men were after, but he wasn't about to find out. Not without getting answers. He needed to draw them away from the garage, away from Emma. His mind worked fast, calculating the best way to keep her safe. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his phone. It was a long shot, but he needed a distraction, something to buy him more time. He quickly texted Steele, knowing that the chapter president would have the muscle to help him if things went south. Trouble at the garage. Need backup. Now. Jake hit send and stuffed the phone back in his pocket, then moved to the side of the yard. He found a loose metal sheet, one of the many old parts he had accumulated over the years. Quietly, he picked it up and hurled it into the bushes near the edge of the property. The sound of the metal crashing into the ground was enough to draw the men's attention. They turned in unison, both of them heading toward the noise. Jake moved quickly, ducking behind the corner of the house and out of sight. He was breathing heavily now, his adrenaline pumping. As the two men walked toward the bushes, Jake slipped behind them, staying as quiet as possible. He moved like a shadow, his body low to the ground, the sounds of his footsteps swallowed by the night. The men were getting closer to the bushes, their backs turned to him. Jake didn't hesitate. He moved in fast, his hand shooting out to grab one of them by the shoulder. The man's eyes went wide in shock, but before he could react, Jake shoved him hard, sending him stumbling into the ground. The other man spun around, his hand reaching for something at his side, but Jake was already on him. He grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply to disarm him. The man's expression changed from confusion to fear, but Jake didn't let go. He was still holding the man's arm behind his back, his face inches from his ear. "Stay away from my garage," Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. "And stay away from her." The man tried to twist out of Jake's grip, but it was no use. Jake was too strong, too focused. He shoved the man hard enough to make him stumble, and with that, the two men backed off, retreating into the night. Jake stood there for a moment, his chest heaving as he watched them disappear into the darkness. It wasn't over. Not yet. But he had bought himself time. He turned and walked back toward the garage, his mind racing. When he opened the door, Emma was still sitting where he had left her, but her face was filled with concern. "Jake," she said quietly. "Are they gone?" He nodded, walking in and locking the door behind him. "Yeah, they're gone. But we need to be careful. I'm not sure who they were or what they wanted, but they won't stop until they get what they're after." Emma stood up slowly, her eyes filled with worry. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake looked at her, his expression softening. "It means we can't let our guard down. Not now. Not ever." The next few days were tense. Jake could feel the weight of the threat hanging over them, like a storm that was waiting to break. The garage, which had once been a quiet place of refuge for him, now felt like a prison. Emma seemed to sense it too. She stayed close, her small presence a constant reminder of the danger lurking just outside their door. She was quieter than usual, her eyes always searching the shadows, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. Jake did his best to keep her distracted. He spent his days working on the bikes, fixing engines and replacing parts, anything to keep his mind occupied. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time he stepped outside, his eyes scanned the street, the trees, the distant shadows. He knew that whoever had been following him wouldn't give up that easily. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next, but the fear never left. One afternoon, as Jake was finishing up a repair on a motorcycle, he heard the sound of footsteps outside the garage. His heart skipped a beat. He turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the tool belt at his waist. But when he saw who was standing in the doorway, he froze. It was Steele Murphy. The chapter president of the Hells Angels stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, his leather vest glinting in the light. Jake didn't know what to make of this visit. He had expected Steele to come after the run-in with the two men, but not this soon. "Steele," Jake said, his voice low, betraying none of the tension that was bubbling just beneath the surface. Steele stepped inside without a word, his eyes scanning the garage, taking in the bikes and tools that were scattered around. He didn't seem to be in a rush, but his presence made Jake uneasy. "You're still here," Steele said, his voice gruff. "Thought you'd have made yourself scarce by now." Jake bristled, but he kept his cool. He wasn't about to let Steele see how on edge he was. "I'm just taking care of things," Jake replied, his tone casual. Steele raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying it. "Taking care of things?" he repeated, his voice dropping a little lower. "You know, Jake, it's not just the club that's been keeping an eye on you." Jake's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what Steele meant. The two men who had shown up that night were just the beginning. There was more to this than he had realized. "What are you talking about?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Steele didn't answer right away. He walked across the room, his boots heavy against the floor. "We've got eyes everywhere, Jake," he said, his voice low. "And people have been asking questions. About you. About her." He turned, his sharp gaze locking onto Jake. "You can't keep running from this. Sooner or later, it'll catch up to you. And when it does, it'll catch up to her too." The words hung in the air, and, for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jake felt the weight of the truth settle over him like a heavy blanket. Emma was in danger, and there was nothing he could do to protect her forever. Steele's gaze softened just a fraction. "I'm not here to make threats, Jake," he said. "But you've got to understand that this thing isn't just about you anymore. It's about the club. And if you're in, you're in. But if you're out, it's not just your life on the line." Jake clenched his fists, the weight of Steele's words pressing down on him. He had made a choice to protect Emma, but the reality of that choice was beginning to sink in. No matter how far he tried to run, no matter how much he tried to protect her, the past was always going to catch up to them. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said finally, his voice hard, resolute. "I'm here to stay, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's safe." Steele regarded him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, Jake," he said, "but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Steele turned and walked out of the garage, leaving Jake standing in the silence. He watched him go, the echo of his boots still ringing in the air long after he had disappeared. For a moment, Jake didn't move. He couldn't. The weight of Steele's words, the unspoken threat that hung in the air, had finally hit him. He was in deeper than he had ever realized. But it didn't matter. He had made his choice, and he would protect Emma, no matter what it took. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. "Jake?" she asked, her voice small. "What's going to happen now?" Jake took a deep breath and walked over to her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I don't know, Emma," he said quietly, "but I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I promise." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. She nodded slowly, and for a moment, everything felt all right. But Jake knew the calm was just temporary. There was more to come. The storm wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after Steele's visit, Jake woke up with a lingering sense of unease. The quiet of the garage, the silence that had once been comforting, now felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He sat on the edge of the cot, rubbing his face with his hands, trying to shake the feeling that had been gnawing at him since the night before. He couldn't deny it anymore. He was in deeper than he had ever planned to be. The weight of Steele's warning still hung over him, a constant reminder that there was no escaping his past, no matter how hard he tried. And now, with Emma in the picture, he couldn't afford to slip up. He had made a promise to her, a promise that he would protect her no matter what. But the world outside had a way of breaking promises, and Jake knew that better than anyone. The sound of footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see Emma standing in the doorway. Her eyes were tired, and there was a quiet sadness to her expression, but she was trying to mask it with a small, forced smile. "Morning," she said softly. Jake nodded in return, though he didn't have much to say. The words felt stuck in his throat. "Are you okay?" she asked after a beat, stepping closer to him. He wasn't sure how to answer her. How could he say that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't? How could he reassure her when he didn't have the answers himself? "I'm fine," he replied, forcing a smile. "Don't worry about me." Emma gave him a skeptical look, clearly not buying it. But she didn't press him further. Instead, she glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the bikes that Jake had been working on for the past few days. "Do you need any help?" she asked, her voice quiet but genuine. Jake hesitated for a moment. He had grown used to being alone in the garage, to keeping his distance from others, but something about Emma's presence made him feel less alone. She was just a kid, but in that moment, she seemed to understand him more than anyone else ever had. He shook his head, his gaze softening. "No, you don't need to help with this," he said, though the truth was, he wouldn't mind having her around. There was a comfort in her presence, something steady and reassuring. Emma didn't say anything more, but she didn't leave either. She sat on the edge of the cot, her legs crossed, and watched him work in silence. For a while, Jake focused on the bike in front of him, trying to distract himself from the thoughts that kept creeping into his mind. But no matter how much he tried, his mind kept returning to the same question. What now? What would happen next? Steele had made it clear that Jake couldn't keep hiding, but Jake wasn't ready to confront the club. He wasn't ready to face whatever was waiting for him out there. And yet, it was coming. The longer he stayed here, the more it felt like a ticking clock. He finished up with the bike, wiping his hands on a rag, and then turned to look at Emma. She was still sitting there, her eyes focused on him. There was a quiet understanding between them, something unspoken. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but in that moment, it felt like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I'm not great at this. At protecting people." Emma tilted her head, her expression curious but not judgmental. "But you're trying," she said simply. Jake blinked, caught off guard by her response. It wasn't what he had expected, but somehow, it was exactly what he needed to hear. He had always been the one who kept his distance, the one who ran from attachments, from commitments. But here she was, a little girl who had been through God knew what, offering him the kind of reassurance he never thought he would need. He smiled, though it was faint. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I guess I am." The room fell silent again, but this time it didn't feel as heavy. They sat there together, two people who had both been broken in different ways, trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. Jake didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something right. As the day went on, Jake's unease began to ease, but it was replaced by a different kind of tension. The kind that came from knowing that he couldn't keep running forever. The world outside was still waiting, and sooner or later, he would have to face it. But for now, he could only take things one step at a time. One day at a time. That night, as Jake sat in the quiet of the garage, his mind still racing with questions and uncertainty, he heard a knock on the door. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately stood up, his hand instinctively going to the knife he kept on the counter. He wasn't expecting anyone, and he wasn't in the mood for company. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to see someone standing there. It was a woman. She was tall, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, and she was dressed in a leather jacket similar to Jake's. Her eyes were serious, but there was something familiar about her, something that made Jake's stomach tighten. "Jake Morrison?" she asked, her voice firm but not unfriendly. Jake didn't answer right away, his mind racing. Who was she? What did she want? The woman seemed to sense his hesitation, because she spoke again, this time a little softer. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help." Jake stood at the door, his hand still on the handle as the woman stared at him, waiting for him to speak. The cold air from the outside brushed against his skin, but he didn't move. His mind was racing. She was here to help, she said, but Jake wasn't so sure he could trust anyone. Not after everything that had happened, not after the warning from Steele. But there was something about her that felt different, like she knew what he was going through, like she understood. Finally, after a long moment of silence, Jake stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice calm, though his heart was still pounding in his chest. The woman nodded, stepping inside. Her boots thudded lightly against the concrete floor, and she removed her jacket as she walked into the garage. Jake closed the door behind her, his eyes never leaving her face. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, his voice low. "And you are?" The woman gave him a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Lena," she said simply, her tone steady. "I've been keeping an eye on things. I know you've been laying low, but you can't hide forever." Jake's muscles tensed at her words, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't sure what she meant by keeping an eye on things, but he didn't like the sound of it. "I'm not hiding," Jake said, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm just taking care of things here." Lena didn't react to his defensiveness. Instead, she walked over to one of the bikes, inspecting it with a quiet intensity. Jake watched her carefully, still unsure of her intentions. "Look," Lena said, turning back to him after a moment. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help, like I said. But you can't keep doing this alone. You've got people who are looking for you." Jake's jaw clenched. He had been expecting this. He had known from the start that running wouldn't solve anything. But hearing someone else say it out loud made it feel all the more real. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lena's eyes softened, just slightly. "I want you to listen," she said. "You've made a lot of enemies, Jake. People who don't forget easily. And no matter how much you try to protect her," she nodded toward Emma, who had been quietly watching from the doorway, "they won't stop. Not until they get what they want." Jake felt a chill run down his spine as her words sank in. He had known this was coming, but hearing it made it all the more real. He turned to look at Emma, who was still standing by the door, her eyes wide with concern. "It's going to be okay," Jake said, his voice softening. "I'll protect you." Emma gave him a small nod, though it was clear she didn't fully understand what was going on. Jake wasn't sure if he understood it himself. Lena watched the exchange, her gaze thoughtful. "You can protect her, but not from everything," Lena said quietly. "There are bigger forces at play here, forces that you can't fight on your own." Jake didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure how to process what she was saying, but something about the way she spoke made him feel like she knew more than she was letting on. "So what do you suggest I do?" he asked after a beat, his voice low. Lena met his gaze, her expression serious. "You need to stop running," she said. "You need to face what's coming, and you need to make a decision. It's not just about you anymore. It's about her. It's about your future." Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had never been good at making decisions, especially when it meant facing his past. But Lena was right. There was no more running, no more hiding. Whatever was coming, it was coming for them. And Jake had to be ready. He looked at Emma, her small face filled with uncertainty, and something inside him clicked. He wasn't just protecting her from the world. He was protecting her from his own choices, from the mess he had made of his life. And that made the decision for him. "Okay," Jake said, his voice steady. "I'm listening." Lena nodded, a small glint of approval in her eyes. "Good. You're going to need help, though? And I can give you that. But you have to trust me. You have to trust that I'm not here to hurt you." Jake hesitated for a moment, weighing her words. But something about her tone felt genuine, and after everything he had been through, he knew that he needed all the help he could get. "All right," he said finally. "I'll trust you. But I'm not making promises I can't keep." Lena gave him a small smile, but there was something more serious behind it now. "You don't have to make promises," she said. "You just have to make it through." Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was it. The storm he had been waiting for was finally here. And now, he had to face it head on. He turned back to Emma, his eyes softening. "It's going to be okay," he said again, though this time, it didn't feel like a promise. It felt like a reality he was finally starting to accept. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Jake had never been one to make plans, but now, he realized that he needed to. Lena's words echoed in his mind, her warning about not running anymore, about facing what was coming. He knew she was right. He couldn't keep hiding from his past, from the things he had done, the people he had wronged. But facing it meant putting Emma in danger, and that was the last thing he wanted. He couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. Every time he stepped outside, his eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of danger. The world outside his garage felt like a ticking clock, and he wasn't sure how much time they had left. Emma seemed to sense the tension in the air. She was quieter than usual, spending most of her time reading or sketching in the corner of the garage. She was trying to stay out of the way, trying to make herself as small and unnoticed as possible. But Jake could see the worry in her eyes every time he looked at her. She was just a kid, but she had already seen too much. He couldn't protect her forever. He had promised to keep her safe, but that promise was starting to feel more and more impossible with each passing day. That afternoon, as Jake worked on an old bike in the back of the garage, he heard the familiar sound of a motorcycle approaching. His heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. Steele was back. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stood up, his mind racing. He hadn't expected Steele to return so soon, and the last thing he wanted was another confrontation. But the truth was, he didn't have a choice. Steele was part of his world, and there was no escaping that. He walked to the front of the garage and opened the door just as Steele's bike came to a stop. The tall, broad figure of Steele stepped off his bike, his leather vest gleaming in the afternoon sun. Steele's face was unreadable, but Jake could see the tension in his posture. It was clear that something was on his mind. "Jake," Steele said, his voice deep and steady. "We need to talk." Jake nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in," Jake said, trying to keep his voice even. "What's going on?" Steele walked into the garage, his boots heavy against the floor. "I've been hearing things," Steele said, his gaze flicking around the room, settling on the bikes. "People have been talking. About you. About her." He gestured toward Emma, who had come out from the back of the garage at the sound of Steele's voice. She stood a few feet away, her eyes wide with concern, but she didn't speak. Jake felt a pang of guilt. He hadn't told her much about what was going on, about the trouble that was following them. But it was too late now. She was already caught in the middle of it. Steele's gaze softened for a moment as he turned to Emma. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low. "But you need to understand something. This isn't just about you or Jake. There are people out there who don't forget, who won't let things slide." Jake's heart sank at the words, but he didn't show it. "I know," he said, his voice tight. "But what do you expect me to do about it?" Steele took a step closer, his eyes locking with Jake's. "You've got to make a choice, Jake," Steele said, his voice serious. "You can't keep running from this. You've got to face it. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're going to drag her down with you." Jake felt the weight of his words. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emma, about her future. And if he didn't make a stand, if he didn't face the consequences of his past, then she would be stuck in the middle of it all. He knew what he had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. "I'm not running anymore," Jake said finally, his voice low but resolute. "But I need your help. I need to know what's coming, and I need to be ready." Steele nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're not alone in this," Steele said quietly. "But you've got to be ready. You've got to trust that we've got your back. The club doesn't forget, and neither do the people you've pissed off." Jake looked over at Emma, who was still standing by the doorway, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and uncertainty. He couldn't protect her from everything, but he had to try. "I'll be ready," Jake said, his voice steady. Steele nodded once and turned to leave. "We'll keep an eye on things," he said. "But remember, the club's loyalty only goes so far. Don't make us regret backing you." Jake watched Steele leave, his mind racing. He had made the decision to face his past, but the road ahead was uncertain. He didn't know what would happen next, or how he would protect Emma from the dangers that were closing in on them. But he wasn't going to run anymore. He couldn't. He turned back to Emma, his heart heavy with the weight of the promises he had made. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. Emma didn't say anything, but she nodded, the faintest trace of hope in her eyes. Jake knew that no matter what happened, they were in this together. And that was enough for now. The days following Steele's visit were filled with quiet tension. Jake had told Emma that things would be okay, but the truth was, neither of them knew what was coming next. The weight of the club's involvement, the ever-present danger, loomed over them like a storm cloud. Jake found himself constantly on edge, his eyes scanning the street whenever he stepped outside, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The garage that had once felt like a safe haven now seemed more like a ticking time bomb, ready to go off at any moment. Emma, for her part, had settled into a routine of sorts. She spent her days in the corner of the garage, sketching or reading, trying to keep her mind occupied. Jake noticed the way she always looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. She had been through too much, and the fear in her eyes told him that she wasn't ready to believe that things were really going to be okay. But he had made a promise to her, and he wasn't about to break it. He couldn't. One morning, after a restless night of sleep, Jake woke up to the sound of a motorcycle revving outside. He froze, his heart skipping a beat as he heard the engine grow louder, coming closer. He stood up quickly, his mind already racing with possibilities. Who was it? What did they want? Was it Steele? Or someone else, someone who had come for Emma? He moved toward the window, peeking out through the blinds. He could just make out a dark figure on a motorcycle, parked at the end of the driveway. The bike was loud, unmistakable. It was another Hells Angels bike. Jake's pulse quickened. He knew he couldn't keep hiding, not forever. Sooner or later, the club would find him. But that didn't mean he had to face them unprepared. He glanced over at Emma, who was sitting on the couch, reading. She hadn't noticed the noise yet, but she would soon. Jake didn't want to alarm her, but he knew they needed to be ready for whatever was coming. "Stay here," he said softly, his voice steady as he made his way toward the door. Emma looked up, her eyes wide with concern. "Jake, what's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with fear. He gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's nothing. Just stay inside. I'll be right back." He didn't wait for her to respond, moving quickly to the door. As he stepped outside, he could feel the cold morning air cut through his jacket, but he ignored it. He had to keep his focus. The bike was still there, idling in the driveway, the engine purring like a predator waiting for its next move. Jake walked slowly toward it, his boots crunching against the gravel with every step. He knew he couldn't just walk out and confront whoever was on the bike. He needed to be smart about it, to figure out who they were and what they wanted. When he was a few feet away, the figure on the bike turned toward him, the rider's face obscured by a helmet. For a moment, there was silence. Then the rider lifted their helmet, revealing a woman with short, dark hair and a determined expression. Jake's eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize her, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was no stranger to danger. "Jake Morrison?" she asked, her voice steady. "That's me," Jake replied, his voice low. "What do you want?" The woman didn't answer right away. She just stared at him, sizing him up. Finally, she spoke. "I'm here on business," she said, her tone blunt. "I've been sent by Steele. He wants to talk to you." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Steele? He had expected something like this, but not so soon. The mention of Steele's name made the air around him feel thick, heavy. "What does he want?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral. The woman gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. "But if you're smart, you'll come with me now. We don't have time to waste." Jake hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore this. He knew it was only a matter of time before the club made their move, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them just yet. "I'm not going anywhere without Emma," he said, his voice firm. The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of frustration. "You think she's safe here?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You're playing with fire, Jake. And the longer you wait, the harder it'll be to put it out." Jake clenched his jaw, but he didn't move. "I'm not leaving her," he repeated. The woman studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to push further. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "Fine," she said. "But don't say I didn't warn you. We're running out of time." Jake didn't wait for her to say anything more. He turned and walked back toward the garage, his mind already racing. He had no idea what this meeting with Steele would bring, but one thing was certain. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. As he reached the door, he turned back to the woman. "I'll be there," he said. "But I'm bringing Emma. If Steele wants to talk, he can talk to both of us." The woman didn't argue. She just nodded and climbed back onto her bike. "Don't make me wait long," she called, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Jake watched her ride off, her figure disappearing into the distance. He turned back to the door, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. Inside, Emma was still sitting on the couch, her eyes searching his face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "We need to go," he said quietly. "Steele wants to talk." Jake didn't wait long. The air was thick with the kind of tension he hadn't felt in years as he walked back inside the garage. He wasn't sure what Steele wanted, or what would happen when they met, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Emma had already noticed the shift in his mood, the way his shoulders were tense, and his movements more deliberate than usual. "Jake, what's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle, but with that unmistakable edge of concern. He turned to face her, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he had made. "We're going to meet Steele," he said simply. "He wants to talk." Emma's face faltered for a moment. "About what?" Jake took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. "About everything. About the club, about the past, about us." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know what's coming, but I need to make sure you're safe. I won't let anything happen to you, Emma. I promise you that." Emma didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, as if searching for something to hold on to. Jake couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She was just a kid, and she had already been through so much. But he couldn't keep running forever. He had to face this, for both of their sakes. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "I trust you, Jake." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so much of his life pushing people away, shutting them out. But here she was, trusting him despite everything. He couldn't let her down. "Not now. We'll leave in a minute," Jake said, walking over to the small table in the corner of the room. He grabbed his leather vest and slipped it on, the weight of the patch on his back suddenly feeling heavier than usual. Steele was part of his past, part of the life he had left behind, but there was no escaping it now. The club was part of who he was, and it always would be. The sound of the motorcycle engine outside brought him back to the present. The woman who had come to get him was waiting. Jake wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. He turned to Emma, who had stood up from the couch and was now looking at him, her face filled with worry. "Stick close to me," he said, his voice firm. "I'll keep you safe." She nodded, though Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He couldn't blame her. He was just as uncertain about what was coming next. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them, biting at their skin. The motorcycle was still parked at the end of the driveway, the woman standing beside it, her helmet tucked under her arm. She didn't say anything as they approached, just nodded toward Jake, and then to Emma. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady. Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Let's go." They climbed onto the bike, Jake in the front and Emma behind him, gripping tightly to his waist. The woman started the engine, the sound loud in the quiet of the street, and they took off, the wind rushing past them as they made their way toward Steele. Jake's mind raced as they rode. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, no idea what Steele had planned or what he was supposed to do next. But he knew one thing for sure. This was the point of no return. He was stepping back into a world he had tried so hard to escape, and there was no turning back. As they neared their destination, the city began to fade into the background, replaced by the open road and the sprawling landscape that stretched out ahead. The house Steele had mentioned was on the outskirts of town, a secluded place that Jake had driven past countless times, but never had any reason to visit. The gates were already open when they arrived, the gravel driveway leading up to a large, looming building. The woman stopped the bike in front of the house and dismounted. Jake followed suit, helping Emma off the bike. "Stay close," he whispered to her, his hand resting on her shoulder. They walked toward the door, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The moment they stepped inside, Jake felt a shift in the air. The room was dimly lit, the smell of old leather and wood filling the space. Steele was sitting at a large wooden table in the center of the room, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He looked up as they entered, his eyes scanning Jake before settling on Emma. "I see you've brought her with you," Steele said, his voice gruff. "I wasn't sure if you'd show up at all, Jake." Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, positioning himself between Steele and Emma. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Steele leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to Emma once more. "I want to talk," Steele said simply. "About what happens next." Jake's stomach tightened. He had a feeling that this wasn't going to be the kind of conversation that left him with answers. But it was a conversation that had to happen. For Emma. For him. For everything. Jake stood tall, his gaze unwavering as he faced Steele across the dimly lit room. The weight of Steele's presence hung in the air, a constant reminder that this wasn't just some casual conversation. There was something heavy at stake, something Jake couldn't ignore anymore. He turned to glance at Emma, who was standing quietly behind him, her eyes filled with confusion and uncertainty. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but Jake knew she could feel the tension between him and Steele. He needed to protect her from this world, from the past he was trying so desperately to leave behind. But there was no escaping it now. "You're not going to get answers by staying silent, Jake," Steele said, his voice cutting through the quiet. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as though he was already 2 steps ahead. Jake clenched his jaw, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm not here to play games, Steele. I need to know what you want. Why am I here?" Steele leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Jake. "You think you're the only one who's been running, huh?" he asked. "You've been hiding, trying to keep your head down. But there's no hiding from this, Jake. There's no running from what you've done. The club won't let you just walk away." Jake's heart raced. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, Steele was bluffing, but deep down, he knew better. The club had its own rules, its own sense of loyalty, and once you were in, it was impossible to get out clean. "I'm done with all of this," Jake said, his voice low and firm. "I'm not part of that world anymore. I've walked away." Steele's laugh was short, almost bitter. "You think you can just walk away from the life you've lived? You think you can just forget everything? Forget the people you've crossed, the deals you've made?" Jake felt a cold knot in his stomach. He had tried to forget, tried to bury the past, and move on, but Steele was right. It wasn't that simple. "I didn't choose this," Jake said, his voice filled with frustration. "I've tried to leave, but every time I try, it pulls me back in." Steele's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hardness in his eyes. "I know you're tired, Jake. I know you want out. But you made choices, and those choices have consequences." Jake turned to look at Emma, his heart heavy. He had promised to protect her, to keep her out of this world. But now, it felt like there was no way to shield her from the truth. She was already a part of it, whether she realized it or not. Steele followed his gaze and noticed Emma standing quietly in the corner. He raised an eyebrow. "Is she part of this now too?" Steele asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. Jake's heart clenched. He hadn't wanted Emma involved, not in this. But the truth was, she was already part of his world now. "She's nothing to do with this," Jake said sharply. "She's just a kid. She doesn't deserve any of this." Steele's gaze softened as he looked at Emma, but only for a moment. "I didn't say she was, Jake," he replied. "But she's with you. And that makes her part of this whether we like it or not." The room fell silent, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jake's mind raced as he processed Steele's words. He had spent so many years trying to escape his past, but it seemed that no matter how far he ran, it always caught up with him. He had made choices, yes, and those choices had led him to this moment, standing in front of Steele with Emma in the room, with nowhere left to hide. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked, his voice quieter now, filled with resignation. Steele studied him for a moment before answering. "I want you to take responsibility, Jake. You can't keep running forever. The club is calling in its debts, and they won't be ignored. It's time for you to make your move." Jake's pulse quickened. He knew exactly what that meant. The club wanted him back. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Emma, about her safety. He couldn't drag her into this world, not if it meant putting her in danger. "I'm not going back, Steele," Jake said, his voice firm. "I've made my decision. I'm not part of this anymore." Steele leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jake. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just walk away from everything and leave it behind?" Jake met his gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm done. I'm not going back to that life. Not for anyone." Steele remained silent for a moment, as if weighing Jake's words. Finally, he spoke again. "You can say that all you want, Jake. But the truth is, they won't let you go that easily. And if you keep pushing them away, they'll come for you. And for her." Steele's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Jake felt the weight of them settle over him. He had made his choice, but the consequences were still waiting for him. "I'll deal with it," Jake said, his voice low but resolute. "I'll handle it. But I won't go back to the club. I won't let them drag me in again." Steele studied him for a long moment, his face unreadable. "We'll see, Jake. We'll see." With that, Steele stood up and turned toward the door. Jake watched him leave, the weight of the conversation lingering in the room. When the door closed behind him, Jake let out a long breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. He turned to Emma, who had been silent throughout the exchange. She was still standing by the door, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice softer now. Emma nodded, though there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "I don't know, Emma, but we're in this together. No matter what happens, I'll protect you. I won't let anything happen to you." Emma looked up at him, her eyes full of trust. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he might just be able to keep that promise. The next morning, Jake woke up with a sense of dread that had settled into his bones. The conversation with Steele lingered in his mind, the words echoing over and over again. No matter how hard he tried to push it aside, the truth was undeniable. He had made a choice. He had walked away from the club, but the club wasn't going to let him go so easily. And now he had Emma to protect. He couldn't fail her. As he stepped outside, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the yard. The air was cool, crisp, and the silence felt almost eerie. He had always been a man of action, but now he found himself frozen, unsure of what to do next. The world was changing around him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the past. He had been part of the Hells Angels for too long. The blood, the loyalty, the violence, it had become his life, his identity. And now, standing in the quiet of his garage with Emma inside, it felt like the world was closing in on him. He ran a hand through his hair, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He had to keep moving forward. He had made a promise to Emma, and he wasn't about to break it. But the reality was staring him in the face. The past wasn't something you could just leave behind. It followed you, no matter how far you ran. He turned back toward the door, and there she was, standing in the doorway with her small frame silhouetted against the light from inside. Her eyes were wide with concern, and Jake could see the quiet fear in them. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. Jake looked at her for a moment, trying to find the right words. "Yeah," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "I'm fine." But the truth was, he wasn't fine. He couldn't be. Not when the world he had tried to leave behind was coming for him. Not when everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was at risk. Emma seemed to sense it too. She stepped closer, her gaze steady. "You're not fine," she said quietly, her voice filled with understanding. Jake swallowed hard, his throat tight. He hadn't realized how much he had been keeping from her, how much he had been trying to protect her from the reality of what they were facing. But she wasn't just a kid. She had already seen too much. She understood more than he gave her credit for. "I'll keep you safe," Jake said, his voice stronger this time, though it came with a sense of finality. "I won't let anything happen to you." Emma didn't say anything. She just nodded, her small hand finding his and holding on tightly. For a moment, Jake felt the weight of everything lift, just a little. But then the sound of a motorcycle engine echoed down the road, breaking the silence. Jake's heart skipped a beat, and he knew it wasn't a coincidence. He didn't even need to look out the window to know who it was. The unmistakable roar of a Harley-Davidson. He glanced at Emma, his grip on her hand tightening. "Stay here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone." Emma nodded without a word, her eyes filled with trust. Jake turned and walked toward the door, his hand lingering on the handle for a moment. He had promised to protect her, but he knew that he couldn't shield her from everything. The world was closing in. As he stepped outside, the cold air hit him, and the familiar rumble of the motorcycle grew louder. He didn't look back as he walked toward the driveway, his steps steady, his mind focused. The rider was waiting at the end of the driveway, his bike idling quietly. The sun was still low in the sky, casting long shadows over the yard, and the rider's face was hidden behind a dark helmet. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he approached the bike. "Steele sent me," the rider called out as Jake drew near. Jake stopped in his tracks, his instincts immediately going on alert. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice low. The rider didn't answer immediately. Instead, they removed their helmet, revealing a woman with short, dark hair and an expression that was as serious as it was unreadable. "I'm Lena," she said simply, her tone steady. "I'm here to take you to Steele." Jake stared at her for a moment, trying to process the situation. He had expected Steele's people to come for him, but not like this. He had thought he might be able to keep Emma safe from all of this, but he was beginning to realize that was never going to happen. Why should I trust you? Jake asked, his gaze sharp. Lena's eyes met his, and for a moment, Jake saw a flicker of something behind her calm exterior. You don't have to trust me, she said. But Steele's not going to wait forever. You know that. You've made your decision. Now it's time to face it. Jake's pulse quickened. He knew she was right. He had made a decision to walk away from the life he had known, but the past didn't just disappear. Steele and the others wouldn't let him go that easily. Let's go, Jake said finally, his voice tight. Lena nodded and turned, walking back to the bike. Jake followed, his mind racing. He knew this was it. There was no more running, no more hiding. Whatever happened next, he would have to face it head on. And Emma, he would have to find a way to protect her. He mounted the bike behind Lena, feeling the cool wind against his face as they sped off down the road. The world was waiting for him, and there was no escaping it now.